You are listening to the Hero's Journey podcast. I'm Jeff Garvin.
And I'm Dan Zarzana.
Let the journey begin.
Welcome to the show. This is episode 0, the call to adventure. Jeff, what are we doing here?
Well, in this podcast, we're going to examine classic and contemporary books and films through the lens of the hero's journey.
And in this episode, we're going to introduce you to the concept of the hero's journey, its origin, and then we're going to dive straight into discussing two stories that we think you're all familiar with.
Spoiler alert, there will be spoilers.
Very spoilers.
Darth Vader is Luke's father.
Much spoilers.
The hero's journey is a set of motifs and archetypes that recur in stories and cultures throughout history, from Sumerian mythology to the Iliad to the Matrix. And the idea was pioneered by Joseph Campbell. He's a renowned American mythologist and writer, and he's probably best known for his 1949 opus, The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
Opus.
Not Mr. Holland's opus, Joseph Campbell's opus. The thing that he did that was incredible was he traveled to every continent on Earth and studied the mythologies and the folklore of big civilizations and indigenous peoples alike. And he studied psychology and he studied theology. And he discovered that there are a set of story elements and character functions that seem to have arisen everywhere independently of one another. And he assembled this knowledge into a cycle that we call the hero's journey.
Enter Christopher Vogler, who is a story analyst at Disney Animation. He had read Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, but he felt it was a bit
esoteric.
Sure, great word.
Yeah.
Great word. If I had a quarter in my pocket, I would give it to you.
You're a mean person.
In his role as a story analyst at Disney Animation, he condensed the Campbell book into a 7-page memo called The Practical Guide to the Hero with a Thousand Faces, circulated this memo amongst his colleagues at Disney Animation. They seem to have taken it to heart because shortly thereafter, Disney Animation Studios experienced a resurgence in the high quality of stories that they put out into the world.
It was the Disney Animation Renaissance.
We're talking about the era of The Little Mermaid,
Beauty and the Beast,
The Lion King,
Aladdin in its own horribly racist way.
So that was so successful that he took this 7-page memo and he expanded it, and then it blossomed into his own book that he titled The Writer's Journey.
I think of it like this. We've got this great source material in Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and then we've got the modern analysis / commentary of Vogler's The Writer's Journey. So since Vogler's approach is specifically adapted for modern storytelling, we're going to start by breaking down the stories that we're talking about according to Vogler's hero's journey structure. And then we'll chime in with some Campbellian detail to deepen and expand the analysis from a mythological viewpoint. Sound good?
Let's do it.
All right.
So here we go. The hero's journey. So for this episode, to introduce the stages of the hero's journey, I'll be talking about Star Wars.
And I will be taking on Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's / Philosopher's Stone. So the first stage of the hero's journey is called the ordinary world, or as Campbell put it, world of common day. In this stage, we see our hero in his status quo normal life. So if you're looking at Harry Potter, you'd see, Harry, he's an orphan, and he's miserable in his muggle life with the Dursleys at number 4 Privet Drive.
In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker also, well, as far as he knows,
Sure.
orphan.
Right? Living with his uncle.
Living with his aunt and uncle also on Tatooine. Just living the ordinary, boring lifestyle of a teenage moisture farmer on a desert planet.
You pointed out they're both essentially orphans living with extended family. And being an orphan or being separated from the parents is a recurring theme in the hero's journey.
Right.
So now that we've seen our hero in his status quo environs, we have the call to adventure.
Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry.
And Vogler took this right from Campbell with no alterations. The call to adventure, the hero is presented with a challenge. And the element that I think is really important is that just the presentation of this challenge renders the hero incapable of going on living in his ordinary world. In Harry Potter's case, he gets a letter inviting him to come attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry.
I mean, that would change your life.
Yeah, you can't go back to just, I'm going to throw out this letter from Hogwarts.
Yeah.
It creates questions that change your world. What is Hogwarts? What is this special world? I'm a wizard. What is all of this?
Right. And it's not just a letter in the mail. It's not an invitation to join the Capital One rewards card. An owl. It's not the postman that delivers
Right.
it. It's an owl.
In Star Wars, what would you call the call to adventure?
For Star Wars, there are a couple of moments actually in the introduction to Luke Skywalker, but I think the primary call to adventure happens at the same time as another sequence, another element of the story that we'll get into a little later. As we'll go through this, we're going to notice that a lot of the elements, while we present them linearly, they don't always happen in the same order.
That's a good point. The hero's journey is not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 formula. They are elements that are like IKEA furniture. You can put them in different configurations to suit your lifestyle.
So the call to adventure for Star Wars would be when Ben Kenobi asks Luke to learn the ways of the Force and come with him to Alderaan.
Ooh. Interesting. To me, the first moment is R2-D2 projects Princess Leia, and Princess Leia says,
"Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope."
that's the thing that has Luke leave the farm and go in search of this old guy.
No,
No?
I
You disagree?
disagree. That gets R2 to leave the farm and go in search of this old guy. But Luke, while he thinks the chick in the hologram is hot, he doesn't.
Right.
He doesn't. There's no reaction. He doesn't. It doesn't call him to action.
You're right. He goes after the droid because that's his.
Because he's going to get busted.
Interesting.
It's just property.
I love it.
R2-D2 is just property of his uncle, and if he loses that droid,
You're
they
right.
just spent money on.
So for you, it's Kenobi saying,
You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan.
yeah.
Interesting. I love it. It's already stage 2, and there's already dissent among the ranks. Okay, so stage 3 of the hero's journey is refusal of the call. The hero, confronted with the fear of the unknown, refuses the call. And one of the things that's fascinating about this in books and film is that sometimes the energy of refusal comes from the hero himself saying, no, I don't want to go. And sometimes the energy comes from without. In Harry Potter, in both the book and the film, the letter gets delivered and Uncle Vernon tears it out of Harry's hands, reads it, and says, no, you're not going to that school. Boards up the door, boards up the fireplace, takes the whole family to that crazy island on the rock. He's trying to prevent Harry from getting this invitation. And Harry the whole time is saying, no, I want to read this letter. What's going on? What is this amazing thing that's happening? Why are these thousands of owls barreling through the window to deliver this message to me? But in the movie, only in the movie, there's a moment where Harry himself refuses the call. And it's when Hagrid says, you're a wizard, Harry. And Harry says,
No, you've made a mistake. I mean, I can't be a wizard. I mean, I'm just Harry. Just Harry.
Chris Columbus, really, the guy who directed the first Harry Potter movie, really understood that when you've got 90 minutes to tell a 77,000 word novel, you've got to be really specific and it has to be personal. And I really liked in the film version that his self-doubt was the thing that had him rejected. Harry himself said, I can't be a wizard. I really related to Harry in that moment.
In Star Wars, the refusal comes directly from the hero. And in this case, Luke says to Ben Kenobi,
I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get home. It's late. I'm in port as it is.
his concern is that his uncle's going to beat his. He's not worried about the Empire, although he says,
It's not that I like the Empire. I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it right now.
You're right. He's mired in the ordinary world, in the day-to-day. That is the essence of the refusal of the call. I refuse to be a bigger person or to exit my sphere of comfort and take on these bigger things. And that is such a common experience that we have, that we don't have an impact on the bigger thing. And that invitation to have that impact terribly threatens us as human beings. It threatens our ego. It threatens our sense of self. And so we reject it. And that's that psychological thing that Campbell would talk about, is that the refusal of the call is the desire to stay inside the ego and to not shift your center of gravity to the real self, to that connection with other human beings.
Luke feels so removed from the rest of the galaxy.
Right.
He's on not only a desert planet, but the part of the galaxy that desert planet is in is itself a desert, so removed from any kind of civilization.
You couldn't possibly set up the stakes better, from being as far from the center to being the linchpin and the savior. There's a great character arc in that screenplay. I think the thing that made Harry Potter so much fun is that Harry wants to be special.
Yes.
He's been miserable his whole life. He's dying to. This is like the best news ever.
Right.
So instead of the second act being, a journey into darkness and disaster, it's a journey into Bertie Bott's every flavored beans and having a home and having a bed and getting Christmas presents. The special world of Harry Potter is so much fun to be in. So the next stage of the hero's journey is meeting with the mentor. This is where the hero receives counsel on how to operate in the special world. A mentor prepares him to face the unknown. In Harry Potter, the first meeting with the mentor is Hagrid. He tells Harry about the magical world. He tells Harry about his parents' murder by Voldemort. And then in Diagon Alley, another meeting with the mentor that's crucial is Harry gets his wand from Ollivander, who tells Harry about that wand's special connection to Voldemort.
I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. It so happens that the phoenix, whose tail feather resides in your wand, gave another feather. Just one other. It is curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar.
And almost that exact same moment happens in Star Wars. When Luke and Ben are in Ben Kenobi's hut in the middle of the desert, Ben Kenobi tells Luke Skywalker about his father and their history, how his father was betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader. He then gets up and goes to this little treasure chest and pulls out Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, and he gives it to Luke, and he tells him about the Force.
So both heroes receive a weapon that has a connection both to their parent and to the death of their parent. The elements of the hero's journey are so clear in these two stories, why we picked them for this episode 0.
Right.
So we've seen the hero in his ordinary world, in his status quo. He's been called to adventure. He's refused the call. He's had a meeting with his mentor, whether it be Hagrid, Ollivander, or Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Right.
And now there's crossing the threshold. The hero has to pass through a barrier to enter the special world. This crossing represents the hero's commitment to taking on this adventure. So possibly my favorite representation of the crossing of the threshold in all of film and literature that I've ever experienced in my life is in Harry Potter.
Really?
Where he crosses the barrier to platform 9 3/4. He literally runs at a brick wall.
Now all you've got to do is walk straight at the wall between platforms 9 and 10. Best do it at a bit of a run if you're nervous.
And it's such a great representation because how many times in your life have you said to yourself, I can't do this?
Yep.
It feels like a wall to me. And you have to have faith, and you run at this brick wall, and then you look up and you're through it. And it's just that act of faith that what I perceive is not reality, and then you're through it. And I think that is the purest expression of that moment. And there's another moment, I believe it's in the first Harry Potter book, where they're walking up the staircases at Hogwarts, and they're exploring the castle, and they discover that some of the walls you can walk through, and that some of the doors are solid walls just pretending. I actually wrote
a song, I think, that I remember.
So my band 7K, actually, I wrote a song called Solid Walls Just Pretending. But that idea that sometimes you think something is an opportunity or a through, and it's just a solid wall. This is the reverse of that, where you're convinced there's no way through, there's no way you can accomplish that task or become that person, and then all of a sudden you're through the wall.
In Star Wars, it's not like in Harry Potter where Harry, by choice, runs at the brick wall at platform 9 3/4. This crossing of the threshold in Star Wars happens to Luke. This is not a choice of his. When he returns home and he finds his farm smoldering wreckage, and his aunt and uncle have been reduced to literal skeletons lying in the dirt.
Yeah.
At that moment, everything that he knows, his entire world has been erased.
Yeah.
And now there's nothing stopping him.
Yeah.
There is no uncle, there is no home. So now there is literally nothing stopping Luke Skywalker from joining Ben Kenobi.
You're right. It's a profoundly different experience to be driven out of the ordinary world as opposed to being invited.
I think they're both powerful moments, though. Harry choosing, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And Luke is ripped
Well,
from his normal mundane life
Yeah.
into the special world of intergalactic planetary travel and lightsabers.
You said intergalactic planetary. So I guess you could argue that Luke could say, "Oh my God, now I can't leave. I have to rebuild my family's farm, or I'm going to go to the academy this season."
At no point during the preceding 30 minutes of that film was he expressing any kind of interest in staying on the farm.
But
he always wants to get out.
You could
and
argue,
now he's got his opportunity.
I agree, but you could argue that when he says, "No, I can't come to Alderaan, I've got to stay home," he does have some kind of loyalty to the family, because he could just abandon his uncle and go be in the academy, but he stays out of some kind of sense of duty or connection to his family. There is an element of choice in Luke's crossing of the threshold, but I agree it's a much different circumstance than Harry's.
That may have been true had Ben Kenobi not introduced him to the Force, given him his father's lightsaber, told him that story. Again, he plants that seed.
Yeah. Oh, agree to disagree then.
Fair enough.
No, this is what's great, is that the whole point of this is that these elements are subjective and that you're going to relate to something in a different way. And that's the beauty of storytelling. And yet, we both agree he crosses the threshold, right?
Absolutely.
The reasons and the circumstances might be different, but you and I are both like, yep, he crossed the line. So I just want to give a little bit of Campbellian detail here. So Campbell calls this crossing of the first threshold. His assertion is that there are several thresholds during a hero's journey. He calls the crossing of the first threshold a release from ego, or the passing through the walls of the world. And when I read that, it gave me chill, because I thought about, J.K. Rowling's Solid Walls Just Pretending.
Yeah.
The idea is this crossing of the threshold, I feel it in my life. Anytime I start a new project, it's that the meanness of a project, whatever it is I identify with about that project, I have to abandon that to get through that wall of the world and into the heart of the story. The other portion, the other subsection of crossing of the threshold that Campbell talks about is the belly of the whale, or the passage into the realm of night, as he describes it. And I don't see it specifically in Star Wars or in Harry Potter. I guess in Star Wars you could see the entry into Mos Eisley, and then the ejection from his home planet into space as a passing into the realm of night. But he talks about...
quite literally, the realm of night is space.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's quite literally.
And he's never been in space before.
And you could say that...
Not that he recalls, but...
Right. Oh, spoiler! But the idea that you're crossing this magical threshold as a transit into a sphere of rebirth. When Campbell talks about mythology, he talks about the birth cycle a lot, and it's symbolized in the worldwide womb of the image of the belly of the whale. That the hero, rather than penetrating this barrier, escaping the ordinary world and penetrating the barrier into the special world, that the unknown beyond actually swallows him up. There's this idea that it's not Luke escaping into space, but it's space encroaching on Luke and sucking him into it. And that kind of validates what you were saying earlier about he doesn't have a choice. The darkness is coming and it's going to envelop him. The stormtroopers have killed his family and destroyed his home, and they're coming for him, and he has to go. There's no staying. So That's that belly of the whale, the darkness beyond the barrier swallowing him up. In mythology, Saturn swallows all of his children because he's afraid that they'll compete with him or threaten him somehow. And then, of course, there's that story of Jonah being swallowed by the whale. Jonah is refusing the call, and the whale says, I'm gonna swallow you.
We're gonna make this happen.
And in order to get out of the belly's whale, he has to answer the call, and then the whale vomits him up.
Yep.
Now that the hero has crossed the threshold, this brings us into Act 2. Act 2 begins with a segment of the journey which Vogler calls tests, allies, and enemies. And this is where the hero, now in the special world, makes new friends. He meets enemies, and he must pass a series of tests to prove his worthiness. So in Sorcerer's Stone, Harry, of course, meets Ron and Hermione on the train to Hogwarts. He also meets Draco Malfoy and Professor Snape.
Turn to page 394.
Boo, hiss.
Boo. And then he goes through these tests. So, for example, he outwits Malfoy on the broomstick during the flying lesson, right? Malfoy's got Neville's Remember All, and he's playing Keep Away, and Potter challenges him and jumps onto his broom, never having flown before, and discovers, wow, there's something he's naturally good at in magic, which is he can fly on a broom. He and Ron defeat the troll in the bathroom and save Hermione. Harry faces the Mirror of Erised, which is more of a test of character. Can he pull himself away from this fantasy of a perfect life? Man, that scene... Every time I read that first book, that scene kills me. Just the pure longing of that chapter,
right,
where he's faced with this vision of his whole family, which he's never had, absolutely kills me. And on a side note, as an adoptive parent, when I read that to my son, oh my gosh, so powerful.
Did it bother him or just you?
I mean, sidebar, this is a story about an orphan who discovers his power as a human being. So watching him enjoy that is a very emotional experience for me. Okay, so the Mirror of Erised, he encounters the Unicorn Slayer in the Forbidden Forest. And then, crucially, he learns that the Sorcerer's Stone, the sort of MacGuffin of the story, right? He learns that it's hidden somewhere in the castle. Those are the events, the tests that really get the plot of the story moving. Tell us about the tests, allies, enemies phase in Star Wars.
Early on, he meets R2-D2 and C-3PO, who aren't exactly allies in the onset. They're kind of a thorn in his side. But they do set the events in motion when R2 escapes the farm in the middle of the night to go look for Obi-Wan Kenobi. That sets this whole thing in motion.
Right.
One of his first tests that he actually fails is his confrontation with the Sand People. The Sand Person... the Tusken Raider that he encounters beats him in hand-to-hand combat, knocks him out, and yeah, that guy. And then later, when they get to the Mos Eisley Cantina, there are the two characters who confront Luke at the bar.
Oh, yeah.
I've got the Death Sentence on 12 systems.
I don't like you either. And then Walrus guy who says very little, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, he goes or something like that.
Wow.
So they toss Luke aside like he's nothing.
Obi-Wan has to bail him out again. Bails him out with the Sand People, bails him out with those two guys at the bar. He's learning that he is not equipped yet to be in the special world.
In that Mos Eisley Cantina also, then they meet Han Solo and Chewbacca, who, upon their initial meeting, it's a confrontational meeting.
Right, Luke is outraged at the price.
Yeah.
And I'll fly it myself.
Right. All of these introductions to these characters are not like, oh, here's your new best friend. Like in Harry Potter and Ron, they take to each other immediately. And while Han Solo and Luke Skywalker end up becoming best friends and nearly inseparable throughout the saga, their first introduction to each other is not one of, oh, these guys are going to be buddies.
Right, you're right. So we've got tests, we've got the allies. How about the enemies?
Well, we've already encountered stormtroopers, and Luke has seen what they can do. And early on, he says that he recognizes the Empire as a threat when he's telling Obi-Wan that he hates the Empire, but now he sees exactly what the Empire does. They are a fascist regime who come in and just lay waste whenever they want to, and they pursue him relentlessly throughout the entire film.
So the part that Vogler calls tests, allies, and enemies, Campbell originally referred to as the Road of Trials.
I like that title better.
You like
than tests, allies, and enemies. That's the Road of Trials has much more of a
it certainly has
heroic
more of a
sound.
Yeah, has a mythical kind of a feel to it. I think the thing I like about tests, allies, and enemies is when I'm writing a story, that gives me three elements to think about. Whereas Road of Trials could be anything. So having been tested, having met allies and enemies, now our hero enters the approach to the inmost cave.
Look at him, he's heading for that small moon.
I think I can get him before he gets there. He's almost in range.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
The inmost cave, and he used the original Campbell term for it, the approach to the inmost cave, and I love it. So the hero reaches the edge of a dangerous place where the object of his quest is hidden. And in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, they get past Fluffy, the three-headed dog. They pass the Devil's Snare, the dangerous plant, and there's that comical moment where the two boys are entangled in the snare and Hermione's free, and she's like, I know that they don't like light. How can I, and I can't remember where in the book it's Harry, but in the movie it's Ron that says, "Are you a witch or aren't you?" Like, you use magic. And she's like, "Oh yeah." And I thought, how many times are you in a situation where you forget the things that you have at your disposal to solve problems because you're in that panic? She says, "Of course." And then she, casts the spell that makes the plant retreat. They have the Room of the Flying Keys where Harry uses his Quidditch skills to capture the key. And then they have to play with the transfigured chess set, which of course is Ron's turn to shine.
That's absolutely.
But then remember, Ron gets knocked out. He sacrifices himself.
Right.
Not the first time we'll see sacrifice show up in the hero's journey.
No.
And then there's the potions puzzle. Hermione figures out which one they have to drink to go on and which one they have to drink to go back, but there's only one person can go on. So part of this approach to the inmost cave, either literally peeling back the allies and leaving the hero alone, or taking away the hero's magic tricks and toys and tools and really leaving just the hero facing his challenge with no outside help. Harry must go forward alone.
That's an awesome moment. It's kind of their first chance to define themselves on their own.
Right? Everything up until now has prepared you to face this challenge, but now it's you. Good luck.
Right.
Yeah.
It happens much later in Star Wars. The approach to the inmost cave is literally the approach to the Death Star. As they're escaping Mos Eisley and they fly to Alderaan, which is no longer there, in place of it is the Death Star. And then they get caught in a tractor beam and pulled right on in, and they can't escape it, and they are pulled into the belly of the beast.
Having approached the inmost cave, now the hero is in the dark, dangerous place, and he faces the ultimate test, often risking death to overcome his worst fear, and sometimes actually appearing to die. That's the ordeal.
Just give me the stone!
You liar!
Kill him!
And in Harry Potter, the ordeal is Harry facing Professor Quirrell, who of course turns out to be nothing more than a vessel for Voldemort himself. Harry and Voldemort/Quirrell have a battle, and then Harry blacks out. When we're reading the book, we don't know if he survives until you start the next chapter. I know because I just read this to my son, and he was not okay with me finishing the end of the nighttime story with the end of that chapter. I had to go 3 or 4 pages into the following scene.
So he could sleep that night.
Harry does not die at this time. I'm saying that because you look worried. I had that. That's the best impression.
You're so good at Gene Hackman impressions.
Oh my
it's
God.
Amazing.
Stop saying that. Anyway, so Harry versus Voldemort, and then Harry appears to die. That's the ordeal.
In Star Wars, the entire Death Star sequence is just one long ordeal for Luke and his allies. They have to hide themselves in the smuggling compartments of the Millennium Falcon to evade the stormtroopers who come in and search the Millennium Falcon. They succeed at that, so now they're able to sneak off of the Millennium Falcon and go and look for the princess. And actually, at that time, they don't know that they're there to rescue Princess Leia. They don't know that she's there.
Oh, you're right. They don't find that out.
The reason Ben Kenobi sneaks off is so that he can disable the tractor beam so that they can get into the Millennium Falcon and try to get out of there before anybody realizes what's going on. It's not until he has left and he has told Luke,
Your destiny lies along a different path from mine.
At that point, they are now without the mentor. And R2 then discovers that Princess Leia is there.
That's
and
right.
she's scheduled to be executed. At that point, Luke takes his first heroic step personally when he says, we need to go rescue her. And he convinces Han Solo to join him. So they use some trickery to get to the detention block, and they find Princess Leia. And at that point, they cause some commotion, and now suddenly the entire Death Star knows they're there.
Oops. They make it worse.
They do. They make it worse.
Star Wars side note, watching Force Awakens reminded me of this about Han Solo, is he's this slick, confident smuggler. But every time he gets into a situation where he has to talk himself out of something, he's terrible at it, right? So he gets into it, he's like, we're all fine here. How are you?
Yeah.
And he gets frustrated, blows the thing up. And in Force Awakens, when the two vying factions that both want the cargo that he's carrying confront him, he's like terrible at making up stories on the spot.
What are you gonna do?
Same thing I always do, talk my way out of it.
Yes, I do. Every time.
That kind of character writing is great. And that 40 years later, he still doesn't get that he's terrible at this. And if it weren't for Chewie and Rey or Luke or whoever was with him, he would be gone.
So during the botched rescue of Princess Leia then takes charge of the situation, blows a hole in the wall, and they all dive down into the garbage chute. That garbage smasher then becomes an ordeal when the walls start closing in. And at that point, that's not only a threat of death for all four of them, but there's the moment before the walls start closing in where that little tentacle worm creature that lives in the garbage reaches up and grabs Luke and pulls him under the water. And time goes by where he's just gone.
We think he might be dead.
And he might not come up. And Han and Leia are searching through the muck, and then they just stop searching and they're just looking. There's no sound except the little lapping of the sewage water as it sloshes up against the garbage.
Yeah.
That's the moment where you're like, oh my God, that may have just been the end of Luke.
And it's very cathartic when Luke finally bursts up from the surface and takes a giant gasping breath, and we all breathe a sigh of relief. And the characters are never the same after that. They're bonded after that moment. They work together in a way they didn't before Luke's symbolic death. And I also want to make another Star Wars side note. Mark Hamill does the best screaming acting of any actor I know. And he has the best screaming mode. There's two of them where Han Solo or Chewbacca takes a shot at the door.
No,
and
it's Han Solo.
Is it Han Solo?
Yeah.
And it bounces. He's like, I already tried it. It's magnetically sealed. And I was a kid. I remember, what did he say? Is it magnetically sealed or hermetically sealed? What is that? And then the other one is, when he's, shut down all the garbage smashers on an detention level. And then, of course, you cut to, so after Luke survives his dunk underwater, then the walls close in, right? And there's another one.
Right.
And, of course,
And you hear C-3PO on the other end after they finally figured out he's figured out, I'll turn on the communicator. I turned it off. Whoops. And he hears
screaming.
His allies, what he thinks is screaming.
And they're celebrating.
In agony as they're being smashed to death. But they're actually celebrating. But, to him, that's a moment where he's like, I wasn't fast enough.
Great comic moment. Mm-hmm. Great comic moment. And it's funny because the screaming without context, celebration without context might sound like death. And in fact, there's that concept in the hero's journey that death and life are just the flip sides of a coin, right? And so those two extremes exist not really on a continuum, but as, halves of a whole.
Another aspect of the ordeal is not only the threat of death to the hero, but sometimes the hero experiences the death of others or causes the death of others for the first time. Toward the end of the ordeal, after they have escaped the garbage smasher and they have made their way back to the hangar where the Millennium Falcon is, they see Ben Kenobi. And for the first time to Luke and Han, this is the first time they've ever seen Darth Vader. We as viewers have seen Darth Vader, and we know that he is a dangerous threat, but Luke Skywalker has never seen Darth Vader before. He doesn't know what he looks like. And Ben Kenobi, at that point, then sacrifices himself to become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
The ordeal is a much more complex affair in Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces than it is in Vogler's writer's journey. He describes a portion called The Meeting with the Goddess. This is a quote from Hero with 1,000 Faces. The ultimate adventure, when all the barriers and ogres have been overcome, is commonly represented as a mystical marriage of the hero with the queen goddess. And so this idea of the meeting with the goddess, this plays out in romantic stories where the love interest represents wholeness or perfection or oneness. But there's the shadow side of that phase that's in some mythology as a recurring element called woman as the temptress, which he also describes as the realization and the agony of Oedipus. It's darker, right? This section deals with the hero losing his innocence. This is a quote. When it dawns on us or is forced to our attention that everything we think or do is necessarily gained with the odor of the flesh, there is experienced a moment of revulsion. Life, the acts of life, the organs of life, and woman in particular as the great symbol of life become intolerable to the pure soul. And so when you read this book that was written in 1949, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and you're looking at mostly Western mythology with some Eastern mythology in there, there's so much misogyny and patriarchy built in. It's astounding. Campbell was not a misogynist or a sexist. It's hard to take him out of context and have him not appear to be, an old white guy with a beard who's he's astoundingly liberal for a guy who wrote in the 1940s in the U.S. He talks about the female in a very abstract sense, not as woman, but as a certain part of the creation myth energy. So there's this psychological ordeal that some characters go through in stories and mythology where they have a revulsion, a rejection of the life energy as represented by the female power. It's this depressing moment, and it's deeply problematic from the viewpoint of modern gender dynamics.
Yeah.
And so there's Oedipus realizing that the queen he's just coupled with is his own mother. And then there's, Hamlet's existential crisis. There's Hamlet and Queen Gertrude have a weird relationship in that play. And so as I was going over my notes in preparation for this podcast, I was surprised that in this woman as the temptress section of the book that I find in some ways really deeply offensive is this wonderful passage about life that I want to read.
Okay.
Every failure to cope with a life situation must be laid in the end to a restriction of consciousness. Wars and temper tantrums are the makeshifts of ignorance. Regrets are illuminations come too late. The whole sense of the ubiquitous myth of the hero's passage is that it shall serve as a general pattern for men and women wherever they may stand along the scale. Therefore, it is formulated in the broadest terms. The individual has only to discover his own position with reference to this general human formula and let it then assist him past his restricting walls. Who and where are his ogres? Those are the reflections of the unsolved enigmas of his own humanity. What are his ideals? Those are the symptoms of his grasp of life. I love that passage. The thing that I love the most about the hero's journey is how applicable it is to living life, not just as a way to look at stories, but as a way to look at your own life as your hero's journey and how to battle the doubt and the demons in your life. So that's
something Vogler talked about too in his introduction to the writer's journey, about how when he read Campbell, it wasn't just a book about story structure and mythology and things like that. He got a personal lesson from it.
Okay. I've talked about meeting with the goddess, woman as temptress, and now there's another portion of the ordeal that Campbell calls atonement with the Father. Atonement is the abandonment of that self-generated double monster. The dragon thought to be God, superego, and the dragon thought to be sin, repressed id. But this requires an abandonment of the attachment to the ego itself. And that's what's difficult. One must have faith that the Father is merciful and then a reliance on that mercy. So again, this is heavy Freud stuff here. And in Star Wars, we see this play out in the original trilogy as Luke first flees from Vader, then confronts Vader, and then saves Anakin Skywalker and redeems him. That is atonement with the Father in the most literal sense, right?
Yeah.
And realizing,
it takes 3 films to get to that point.
And so in Harry Potter, we see this play out in 2 ways. One, Harry grows up and he uses his father's cloak. And then his Patronus is a stag, right? Which is what his father used to transform into when he was an animagus, or animagus, depending on your pronunciation. And then when he meets his father in Goblet of Fire, when he casts Priori Incantatem, and all the spells. Thank you very much. Well, it was after animagus, it was easy to say Priori Incantatem. So he meets his father coming out of the wand, right? And then he sees the dark side of his father in Half-Blood Prince, in The Pensive, where his father is taunting Snape.
Yep.
So you see this atonement with the Father, not really in the ordeal of these 2 particular stories, but as it's played out over the series. And that's the genius of Joseph Campbell, is that it's hard not to find this stuff. And then to draw the parallel between Voldemort and Darth Vader, Voldemort is like a shadow version of Harry's father. When he curses Harry and he gets that scar, he imparts the ability to speak Parseltongue, the ability to see and feel what Voldemort is seeing and hearing. The Sorting Hat says you could have been in Slytherin. So clearly there's some part of the dark father Voldemort that's in Harry. Having survived the ordeal, our hero goes on to a portion of the journey called Reward, or Seizing the Sword. Having faced his worst fear, the hero seizes the object of his quest. In Harry Potter, Harry uses his knowledge of the Mirror of Erised and retrieves the Sorcerer's Stone and prevents Voldemort from getting his hands on it. Campbell calls this the ultimate boon, a boon being a prize or a trophy.
Yeah.
Obviously, in this case, it's a physical object. It's the stone itself. The other portion of this stage that's so important is that it shows that the hero is no longer part of the ordinary world. He is fully committed to the special world. Harry is no longer merely a student escaping his miserable life with the Dursleys to go to wizard school. He has now declared himself to Voldemort's face, I am your enemy, which is another threshold.
In Star Wars, what he discovers by rescuing Princess Leia is that ever since he and Uncle Owen bought R2-D2 from the Jawas on Tatooine, he was in possession of the ultimate boon this entire time.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the knowledge that R2-D2 is carrying the technical readouts for the Death Star that shows the weakness that leads to them being able to destroy it. And it took them going into the Death Star and risking life and limb to save Princess Leia to learn that information.
Right.
It's not like he went into the inmost cave and seized the sword. He had the sword the whole time.
Right.
So it's another example of how these elements are non-linear. They can be in different parts of the story in all kinds of different works. So our heroes have survived their ordeals. They have seized their swords. And that brings us to the end of Act 2. Let's take a break, and we'll get into the final climax. No?
That's what it's seizing their swords and having a final climax.
All right, so this is the What Are We Drinking segment of the podcast.
What are Jeff and Dan drinking?
Jeff and I both we do enjoy the beers. We do
adult beverages from time to time.
We do enjoy the whiskeys. Yeah. So to celebrate this inaugural episode of the Hero's Journey podcast, I found a beer that I think, I'm hoping it's appropriate. So it's from San Fernando Brewing Company, which is very near
that's
our location here, right here in Southern California.
Less than 5 miles from Studio Z in Burbank, where we're recording this.
All right, so on the count of 3, go ahead and take the bag off of the bottle.
Let me describe this for the listeners here. Dan has, on the table where we have our microphone set up, he has placed a very, very large bottle, 2 very large bottles, with the Bevmo paper sack concealing what's inside. I'm going to pull this bag off on the count of 3.
Okay, 1, and a 2, and a 3.
What, Imperial Death Star Stout.
Right?
Yes!
Right? I couldn't find a Harry Potter-related beer for you, but I figured since one of the other stories we were doing here was Star Wars, Imperial Death Star Stout. What?
Epic. So we will pop open these bottles of San Fernando Brewing Company's Imperial Death Star Stout. Cheers.
Cheers.
Ooh. It tastes like the dark side.
I was just going to say that.
That's delicious.
It's good?
Yeah, that's really good. We'll be back. I'm going to take one more sip of my Imperial Death Star Stout before we launch in.
You must do what you feel is right, of course.
I'm glad I swallowed before you said that. All right, diving into Act 3 of the hero's journey. The first stage, Vogler terms the road back. This is where the hero is pursued by vengeful forces that were disturbed when he seized the sword. And it is completely absent in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. He fights Voldemort, blacks out, wakes up in the hospital wing with Dumbledore. There's no road back. Mm-hmm. I think part of the reason is that, like you said earlier, the audience is young, and so Harry confronting Voldemort, that's intense enough. And it's funny because I witnessed that reading it to my kid. Like, that was plenty of drama.
Yeah.
It needed to be back in the safety of Dumbledore's world. The other thing is Vogler kind of condensed a number of Campbellian moments into the road back. And so I want to hear what you have to say about Star Wars, and then I'll do my best to very quickly elucidate Campbell's other moments.
The road back absolutely exists in Star Wars, and that is seen in the flight of the Millennium Falcon from the Death Star. The vengeful forces are the TIE fighters that chase them. There is another ordeal when Luke and Han have to mount their laser cannons and defend the ship while Chewie tries to do some evasive maneuvers, and Leia, sitting from her spot in the cockpit, calls out when she sees TIE fighters passing in front of the ship. It's all kind of a collective effort to defeat the 4 TIE fighters. So that return back to the moon of Yavin, that is the road back.
So here's Campbell's take on what Vogler calls the road back. The first stage is the refusal of the return, and it's kind of an echo of the refusal of the call to adventure. The hero now resists re-entering the ordinary world, or he's prevented by outside forces. Then there's the magic flight, and there are 2 kinds of magic flight. The first is if the hero entered the inmost cave with permission and the blessing of the gods, then supernatural forces aid him in returning to the ordinary world. But if he snuck in without permission and stole the treasure from the dragon, he now has to run for his life.
And that's what the flight of the Millennium Falcon from the Death Star is. That is that magic flight moment.
They poked the dragon,
Yeah.
stole Princess Leia, alerted the whole battle station, and essentially made it worse because now they lead the whole Empire to the base.
Unbeknownst to them, Darth Vader has convinced Governor Tarkin, let's let them go. Let's not make it obvious that we're letting them go so they don't suspect that something is wrong. And they have planted a tracking device on the Millennium Falcon.
I love when the heroes doing what's right makes everything worse. Okay, there are 2 other sections of the road back in Campbell's world. The next is the rescue from without, and that's the idea that the hero may not be able to return without aid. He may need to be rescued. In other words, the ordinary world may have to come get him and bring him back. The reason why it was so important to me to bring in Campbell and not just go with Vogler's model is because while the road back is totally absent from Harry Potter, the rescue from without absolutely is. Dumbledore arrives just in time to keep Voldemort from killing Harry.
Star Wars has a very similar moment. At the end of the Death Star trench run, at that point, it's just Luke Skywalker in the trench, and he's making his way to the exhaust port, and Darth Vader and his 2 cronies are right on his tail. And out of nowhere, Han Solo, who earlier had said, no, I'm in it for the money, I'm out. He comes out of nowhere and destroys one of the TIE fighters, which then causes a chain reaction in the second TIE. And suddenly, you're all clear, kid. Let's blow this thing and go home. And that is one of those stand up and cheer moments.
Harrison Ford's performance in that moment is so great. He's got this giant grin on his face. He so understood what was going to happen in the movie theater in that moment. And that's what makes him such a great action star.
You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
The final stage that Campbell talks about within that motif that Vogler calls the road back is the crossing of the return threshold. The hero has crossed into the special world. He's accomplished some great task. He's seized otherworldly knowledge, enlightenment, essentially. And now his challenge is to somehow take that back into the real world. But it's like making a 2-dimensional drawing of a 3-dimensional cube. It just doesn't translate. He has to find some way to spread that knowledge or something that he's brought back. Great example is in The Matrix. Neo is told by Morpheus, you can't be told what the Matrix is. You have to be shown. And so their great challenge is it's hard to convince people. It's hard to enlighten people. I think the only parallel I can see in Harry's world is whatever magical skill he has, it doesn't play out in the Muggle world. He's not allowed to use magic. And of course, there's the joke at the end of the first book that Dudley doesn't know that, so he can use it to threaten Dudley. Right. But even that backfires. So it's the idea that this special thing that the heroes obtained, it doesn't always translate back into the ordinary world.
I don't feel that Star Wars has that because Luke, from the moment that he uses the Force to destroy the Death Star, he accepts the Force. There is no rejection of, oh yeah, I can't use this in polite company. It's expected.
You bring up a good point, which is in Star Wars, the ordinary world is essentially an illusion of security and safety that Luke feels because he's so isolated. And when he travels into the, quote, special world, he's really just realizing this is how things actually are. The ordinary world, as it were, was destroyed. You could make an argument that the ordinary world is peace and that the special world is a war against the Empire. But it's still not as clear-cut as it is in Harry Potter, where there's clearly the Muggle world and the Wizarding world,
right.
and never the twain shall meet. And when they do meet, it's a disaster that needs to be addressed, right?
Right. In Star Wars, it's not really a special world. It's just the world. The world is in this upheaval, this period of civil war. There are some planets and peoples that are so far removed from it that it doesn't really affect them, like on Tatooine, until the Empire does show up because they're looking specifically for the droid carrying the Death Star plans.
Well,
but otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to Tatooine.
And you hit the nail on the head, because remember, when Lucas wrote this, he wrote it as an indictment of what had happened in the United States politically with their imperial policies in Southeast Asia. I think he imagined that the audience was Luke Skywalker and that they were going to become awakened to what was really going on. So the penultimate, I've been waiting my whole life to use that word, stage of the hero's journey is resurrection.
Use the Force, Luke.
And in this stage, the hero is purified by death, either in a literal or symbolic way, and returns to the land of the living a changed person. In Harry Potter, Harry awakens in the hospital wing, and Dumbledore explains that Harry has vanquished Voldemort for now, and the stone has been destroyed.
And in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker has successfully destroyed the Death Star, but only narrowly, having been at the last second rescued by Han Solo. Had Han Solo not done that, Luke Skywalker would have surely been killed. That was his symbolic resurrection. One of many. That's like the third one of the films.
We talked about how the hero's journey is not always a linear progression. This element of resurrection recurs in Star Wars during that final trench sequence where Luke is speeding toward the exhaust port where he's going to fire his proton torpedoes. Obi-Wan Kenobi appears to him and says, use the Force, Luke. That is a kind of resurrection. And like we talked about in the ordeal section, Luke appears to die under the water and then comes back. That is quite literally a baptism and resurrection.
Yeah.
So again, these stories that we talk about, even something as far out as Star Wars, has deep connections to mythology and folklore, has a lot in common with stories in the Bible. The belly of the whale is that trash compactor. That's Jonah in the belly of the whale.
Right.
So the genius of the hero's journey is that Campbell recognized not just elements of the story, but elements of the way the human mind is constructed. These things exist in dreams. These things exist in folklore. Cultures that never spoke to one another have similar mythologies. There's something about the way the human mind has evolved that these things just exist. And so it's satisfying when a well-told story touches all these points. To me, it's the biggest thing you can point to say this is why Harry Potter is popular. This is why Star Wars is popular. There's something about these elements.
Right.
If they're applied in a well-told story, resonate within our psyche, our collective consciousness as a species.
Yeah.
So, in Resurrection, Campbell adds a part called Master of the Two Worlds. And this is characterized by the freedom to pass between the ordinary world, or the material and mundane world, and the special world, the world of the divine, or the spiritual, or the magical world. That's the true gift of the Master, this ability to pass between the two worlds. And of course, now that he's initiated into the magical world, Harry can go back to the Muggle world on the Hogwarts Express and return to school the next year. He now has this ability to operate in both worlds. Now, as we discussed in Star Wars, the ordinary world is gone.
He is just forever now in the special world of, now I am a Force user.
So the final stage of the hero's journey, return with the elixir. The hero, having won some precious treasure or reward, now returns to the ordinary world to share the spoils of battle. In Harry Potter, I see two expressions of the return with the elixir. The first is that having prevented the return of Voldemort, Harry and his friends win the House Cup for Gryffindor. This sort of normal school contest becomes a celebration of a victory over evil.
Yeah.
And then Harry takes the Hogwarts Express back to the Muggle world, but now armed with magic and a new sense of self-worth, we know he won't be as miserable at the Dursleys. Or will he?
I don't feel that there is much of a return with the elixir in Star Wars, at least at the very end of the film. It's that element is married with the road back element.
When I think of Star Wars and the return with the elixir, I just think of that final scene where they all get medals. It's like that short sequence of Leia putting medals on Han and Luke is all the audience needs to know we won.
Yeah.
Because it's such an abstract win. I mean, they blew up the Death Star. That's not abstract. But the idea that they've brought peace to that part of the galaxy, you could have played it out in dialogue. But after you just blew up the Death Star, that would be so anticlimactic. So I think it was brilliant that Lucas did that scene. And it's a testament to John Williams. Because if you go on YouTube, you can see a cut of that whole scene with no music. Have you seen this?
I have. I think that's not entirely honest. Isn't that fake? Where you hear the extras coughing and?
Well, I mean, yeah, the sound they put in there is there is no sound. That was all shot MOS, I assume, because they knew it was going to be a big magical ending, or maybe they did. But there's no dialogue. It's just like these looks, right? Where like they're being presented with awards, and it's not like congratulations, Luke Skywalker, for winning the. So we'll put the link in the thing, but you watch that and you go, oh, this was brilliant. They knew this was going to be 40 seconds with a blazing soundtrack, and it's all you need. You need a moment after the Death Star blows up to have the heroes be acknowledged.
Yeah.
So the only other Campbell moment is he calls Return with the Elixir freedom to live. And again, this dips into the psychological part of the monomyth, which is the reconciliation of the individual consciousness, your awareness of who you are, with the universal will. That is the ultimate gift, is the realization that you and the universe aren't distinct. The special world and the ordinary world aren't distinct. It's all one thing. That's enlightenment.
And that's it. Episode 0 in the can.
Join us next month when we will be analyzing Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King, which is the novella that inspired the movie that literally everyone loves, The Shawshank Redemption.
If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are given away absolutely free of charge.
And if you love what you heard, please take a minute to write a review. That makes a big difference.
Thanks to Taylor Jordan for our amazing Hero's Journey fanfare and bumper music, and to Dean Ethington at DAE Design for our logo and our website.
We want to thank San Fernando Brewing Company for the amazing Imperial Death Star Stout.
If you want to see what we're reading, watching, drinking next, visit us at heroesjourneypodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Heroes Podcast, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/heroesjourneypodcast.
We are proud to be a part of the 1888 Center family of podcasts. 1888 serves as a regional catalyst for the preservation, presentation, and promotion of cultural heritage and literary arts.
You can visit the center's cafe, gallery, and bookshop physically in historic downtown Orange, California, or online at 1888.center.
Star Wars is copyright 1977 20th Century Fox Film Corporation. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, copyright 1997 by J.K. Rowling. The film of the same title is copyright 2001 Warner Brothers Pictures. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jeff.
Journey on.